Thank you so much, Richard, Marla, and Lex. I really appreciate your 3 presentations. Our last speaker today is Sam Hughes. Sam is going to be speaking about emerging research on unique fetish interests and communities.
Great, so I was asked to take a 4-hour continuing education workshop that I taught last month and condense it down into 10 minutes. So we're going to do this at kind of a clip. Just a quick word about me. I'm a PhD candidate in social psychology at the University of California, Santa Cruz, and my work studies kink, BDSM, and sexual fetishism. My current dissertation project is focused on analyzing 83 in-depth interviews with folks involved in the erotic hypnosis community. And so I'm going to be talking through 6 kink and fetish interests that there's some emerging research on, but often doesn't get the kind of attention paid to that a lot of other BDSM and kink type topics often do. This is partially because most of the literature generally focuses on kind of mainstream kink and BDSM behaviors like bondage and sadomasochism. And so I'm doing kind of a brief overview of the existing literature in these areas. So to start off with, we have pup play. So pup play involves sexual and or intimate play in which one or more individuals takes on the role of a canine. So sometimes you'll see this take place in moshes where people are getting together as sort of puppy individuals and playing with pup toys, or people that might eat meals out of a dog bowl as part of a domination submission relationship that they might have, or as part of trying to enter into some kind of psychological headspace about sort of feeling like they're a puppy or feeling like they're an animal. We know from the research literature that for some folks, this is explicitly a sexual interest, and for other folks, it's not. With one participant in a study on pup play saying, with me pupping, yes, it's very sexual, and if I'm not in an event, and if I'm being a pup with my partner, then yes, it will almost always definitely involve fisting and or fucking, him fucking me, or even me fucking him as a pup. I've done that before. He wanted to get fucked by a pup, so I had my muzzle and I fucked him. So yeah, it's definitely a sexual thing for me. For other folks, they might construct the idea of a puppy as innocent, as a sort of asexual or almost childlike being. And so for them, they say that it's largely an asexual experience, saying, to me, pup play is innocent, it's just being a pup. We've also seen pup play explode in popularity recently, particularly among gay and bisexual men, with one participant in one study on pup play saying, it was really rare up until about 4 years ago, I suppose. I mean, it's meteoric since then, you know, that pups have been coming out of the woodwork from nowhere. Then all the big fetish shops started selling pup gear, of course, you know, jumping on the bandwagon, so that's helped it expand. I think social networking probably made it take off because before Twitter and things like that, there was no way of really communicating to people about pup play, but now you can find out about it everywhere. For many participants in all of these fetish communities I'm going to talk about, Twitter and Discord and other online spaces have played a really central role in getting a lot of these communities going because it allows people to find people with shared interests, especially in an anonymous space. Lastly, we have a lot of folks in the pup community talking about the idea of pup mode or pup space as a kind of headspace, similar to what you might see in dom space or subspace in the BDSM context. One participant describes an experience of time distortion, saying, it's about the time perspective I found. I was playing with pups over the weekend, and that lasted quite a few hours, but it didn't feel like that at all. You don't realize it when you've fallen into that headspace. Another participant talked about it as being kind of an animalistic or instinctual headspace, saying a basic mindset where you forget or ignore the human thinking part of the brain and go more instinctual. The next one we're going to focus on is furry fetishism, or the furry fandom. So this is a pattern of interest in anthropomorphic animals and or wearing or seeing others wear anthropomorphic animal mascot costumes. Importantly, for some folks, this is a sexual fetish, but for other folks, this is more of a sort of broader community of artwork and other kinds of activities. We've seen a surprising amount of research on furry communities start to emerge, in part because many furry conferences actually have in-house research that's taking place, where there are individuals that are giving surveys at these conferences with a lot of support from the furry community. The furry community has a lot of nerds in it, and so they generally tend to be pretty supportive of research. What we know from the literature is that most furries are pretty young. So this is largely a fairly young person's community. It's mostly folks that are white and assigned male at birth, though it does appear that there's a pretty high proportion of folks that are trans, either binary or non-binary. And it's also mostly a non-religious community. Lastly, we know that for a lot of folks, they have some interest or some involvement in the furry community before the age of 18, which is part of what makes the sort of sometimes sexual and sometimes not sexual nature of the community challenging for a lot of furries to navigate. Furries report a wide variety of origins for why they might be interested in taking on these kinds of roles as an anthropomorphic animal, sometimes called their fursona. So for a lot of folks, they might talk about it as a certain media inspiration, like a Disney cartoon or movie, whereas other folks talk about it as taking place through a friendship relationship that they might have, or through internet spaces that they've been exposed to this kind of either furry arts or furry community. Several folks within the furry community pretty clearly demonstrate that it's not at all a sexual thing for them, but there's a wide spectrum that exists in terms of to what extent this is about a sort of sexually arousing fetish experience, and for other people that this might be about being able to sort of get out of oneself or being able to experience a different kind of social role. We know from some of the literature on furry communities that there tends to be really high rates of mental health challenges, both as a result of external discrimination that's taking place. For example, more than half of furries report having been physically bullied, or in a smaller proportion saying they've been physically bullied a great deal, or experiencing harassment or shame over the fact that they're a furry, including some people who've been told to kill themselves. Similarly, there's really high rates of mental health challenges in the community, very high rates of both depression and anxiety, as well as really high rates of suicidal ideation. We also see some furries that specifically identify social anxiety disorders as one of the primary reasons why they're a furry, with one participant in the furry community saying, "Being a furry lets me express myself more and get rid of my social anxiety. I do not have an urge to commit suicide whatsoever, and I'm generally happy with who I am for right now." The idea of sort of donning a mascot costume or donning an alternative persona as a way to cope with the experiences of social anxiety can be really helpful for some furries, and especially might be helpful for furries that are on the autism spectrum. The third one I'm going to cover here is ABDL, or age play. So this is where people take on a role that's different than their actual chronological age. And then specifically for some folks, it's about being a baby or a person that plays with diapers. ABDL is the acronym that we see for that. There isn't a ton of literature on ABDL, but the motivations that we generally see for ABDL focus sometimes on the sort of sensory aspects of diapers. Sometimes that has to do with urinating in diapers and feeling the kind of warmth and wetness experience. For other folks, it's explicitly about experiencing a kind of age regression, so taking on a different age role than they might be chronologically. For some folks, they talk about it as a form of trying to maintain their emotional or physical well-being, especially around the kind of stresses of being an adult and being able to take on a role that might help escape from some of those stresses temporarily. For some folks, especially those who have physical incontinence issues, there's a sort of not having to worry about your bodily functions, which can help reduce some of the stress they might experience. For other folks, there's a kind of taboo element to it, which they find particularly appealing. And lastly, some folks in the ABDL and age play community explicitly talk about ABDL and age play as a way to sort of engage with kink, but not having to do anything related to BDSM, because they expressed a pretty explicit dislike of BDSM. We know there's some unique intersections as well for folks that are part of lesbian, bisexual, transgender, or queer age play communities, with one participant in a study that focused on that community and their age play experiences. They noted that female to male interview partners mostly had explicitly feminist backgrounds and didn't want to reproduce sexist behaviors when expressing their genders. And so identifying with a not quite yet hegemonic masculinity of a boy as opposed to a grown-up man served to distance themselves from the association with that hegemonic masculinity of the grown-up white heterosexual man. So for some folks who have these kind of explicit feminist commitments, this is one way of processing through that. About 2% of this community has actual urinary incontinence problems, and so this is a way in which they help to manage those kinds of issues. I'm going to skip past cuckolding just in the interest of time, but the general findings that we have is that heterosexuals seem to be a lot more motivated by racial dynamics in cuckolding than gay men are, but there's a wide variety of different motivations that people might have for cuckolding fetishism. Erotic hypnosis fetishism, which is what my dissertation is focusing on, is the incorporation of hypnosis for intimate or sexual play. For some folks, this involves actual trance states that they're getting their partners into. And for other folks, this is largely a role play activity. It takes place both in person online, and it's a surprisingly widespread fetish. It's one of the most popular fetishes on FetLife, despite it being banned as a search term on FetLife for many of the communities. We only have 3 papers that have been done so far on erotic hypnosis, most of which have focused on analyzing online artifacts, so trying to look at the pornography that's created by communities or look at forum postings, but no study to date has actually involved talking to people in the erotic hypnosis community, which is why I conducted my dissertation study with 83 interviews. We found that there were 10 different motivations people expressed for why they're interested in erotic hypnosis. Some look very similar to what we might see in BDSM contexts, like exploring power, control, and trust, or experiencing an altered state of consciousness, just like Subspace. Some talked about being introduced by another person, such as the current romantic partner, and others cited media exposure experiences. So often does Kaw hypnotizing Mowgli in the Jungle Book cartoon come up that it's a meme in the community. We also found folks talking about trying to experience physically or ethically impossible kink interests, and that erotic hypnosis was a way for them to subjectively experience those things as real. Others talked about it as a kind of meta kink for sprinkling in on other kinds of kink interests, so being able to sort of do hypno rope instead of doing traditional rope bondage. Some people talked about wanting to get dumbed down and the stresses of being sort of a smart, geeky, or nerdy, or STEM-oriented person. And lastly, folks also talked about coping with physical or mental health challenges. I'm going to go through 2 examples of this just to illustrate it. For talking about physically impossible kink interests, one participant said, so like somebody wants to be abducted by aliens and taken to a spaceship, you can do that with hypnosis. If you want an ogre gangbang, you can do that with hypnosis. Things that aren't possible, for a variety of reasons. You can dig in, chain, they can be characters, they can change their body shapes and become animals or other, whatever else, robots, anything else they can be. That's the stuff that I find the most interesting. We also had a participant who argued that erotic hypnosis may have actually saved his life, saying, I've been depressed basically as long as I can remember, and it's been pretty severe. I'm not actively suicidal. I was a lot in my early 20s especially. Experiencing something like ego death through hypnosis can be, it's not therapy, but therapeutic. When you're suicidal, you're not wanting to die exactly, you're wanting the pain to stop. Having just a taste of oblivion that you can come back from afterwards is so, so nice. It's methadone for suicide, to put it flippantly. The last fetish that I'll very briefly go over, because I'm running out of time here, is haircut fetishism. This is people that are sexually aroused by the experience of haircuts or giving haircuts or choosing haircuts for people. Sometimes it's a sexual experience associated with BDSM activities, and other times it's not a sexual experience. It's even something that is performed by some sex workers as part of traditional kind of hair salon activities. And for some folks, it's a humiliation activity, especially involved in sort of male pattern baldness fetishism. To date, there's only one study that's ever been done, and it was a study based on some data from the 1990s that didn't get published until this last year. But it finds that there's a wide variety of motivations for why people engage in this particular kink as well. My contact information is available here if anybody has any questions, but thank you all so much for watching this very shortened version of a 4-hour continuing education workshop, and I look forward to seeing your questions.
Sam, thank you so very much for taking 4 hours and condensing it down into 10 minutes or 12 minutes. Really appreciate that. And of course, everyone can reach out to Sam potentially through the email that is posted there, ask more questions. And once again, possibly with all 4 presenters, we might do individual sessions at some point in time for these people to speak for a full hour, hour and a half, something like that. Any questions?
Wendy's asking, are you doing that training again in the future? I did it through Tasha, so it's up to Tasha if they want to run it again. Or I might do other kink and fetish interests too, for folks who went to the first one who may want to, get some exposure to some other stuff. A lot of my work tends to focus on kind of niche kink and fetish interests because I think that's a sort of gap in the literature compared with a lot more of the literature we see on BDSM. And then I think everyone's going to get access to the recorded session, right, Frederick?
Yes, so we are recording this partially because we have international membership and some time zones are sound asleep right now, but it is also our intent to make this publicly accessible.
So primal play generally takes on roles in which someone is a predator and someone is prey. And that often looks a little bit different than what you might see in like pup and pet play, where the relationship is more likely to be between a human and a pup. So there's usually a handler-pup dynamic in a kind of DS context. Sometimes, though, the relationship is between other pups, and they'll often talk about it as being an alpha pup and a beta pup. So rather than it being a kind of predator-prey, violence chasing kind of dynamic that you see in primal play, it's a little bit more of a kind of domination, submission, familial relationship kind of dynamic that you're more likely to see in that kind of pet play. In terms of furries, a lot of the furry fandom isn't actually doing play. It's about artwork, it's about community, it's about going to conventions and seeing others. When folks are doing any kind of sexual play or intimate play involving being furries, a lot more of what you see is kind of cuddling and genital fondling through fursuits, or individuals that are like wearing tails as part of their experience in the furry community. So there's some pretty significant differences between primal play, which you see a lot more in kind of heterosexual, bisexual spaces, and pup play and furry community play, which you see a lot more in gay men's and bisexual men's spaces. The communities definitely cross over. There's quite a few pups that are in the furry fandom, and there's quite a few furries that are in the pup play community. I think both speak to the sort of need or desire to experience oneself as an animal. And what studies do I recommend about cuckolding? There's two. One is Justin Lee Miller's study that looks at gay men's fantasies of cuckolding. That one is published right now. And then the other one is David Lay's book on cuckolding fetishes, where he sort of went into that book assuming he was going to find a bunch of people with insecure attachment, and then found out that it was mostly people with very secure attachment that were engaging in a lot of this cuckolding play. And thank you all so much. I really appreciate your time. Sorry, I had to go through that at a clip. Francesca asks, do you have any sense that parts of the furry or pet play gives permission for non-sexual connection? That just moved on me. A non-sexual connection, petting and cuddling that might not be as easeful for flag in the gay community. So I definitely think that for a lot of folks that are into both furry and pet play, there's a kind of sensory, intimate experience that's going on that doesn't have to be sexual, right? And so the idea of getting sort of scritches behind the ears, or you know, someone coming up to you and giving you a hug in the same way that like someone might hug someone in a mascot costume in the furry community. I think both of those are ways to experience like intimate physical contact, but also with either a barrier of identity or a physical barrier that's involved there, which can be really helpful for folks with social anxiety. It can also potentially be really helpful for folks on the autism spectrum, because sometimes that like physical contact experience can be like a very intense sensory experience, but having a barrier like a fursuit on while also experiencing that kind of cuddling or that kind of hug is a way to sort of make that experience less intense and a little bit more manageable for some folks. And I think for like flagging in the gay community, I mean, there's a lot of folks in the gay community who don't even flag anymore, right? This is like, in a lot of ways, a historic practice, although there's definitely some folks who'll still do it at contemporary gay bars. But I think that for a lot of folks that are in the furry or pet play community, like they'll flag by wearing a tail usually. That's a really common practice that I've seen.